It's wonderful to be here at the Courtauld Institute of Art, where, as you've just heard, I studied for my master's degree, and which has educated the leaders and scholars of so many arts institutions. My own career as a museum curator actually began as an undergraduate at Smith College, which is an all-women's college in Northampton, Massachusetts. And at Smith, I undertook my freshman year the epic Art 100 course. So Art 100 at Smith was, in a way, it was like a rite of passage. It was an epic year-long survey of mainly European painting, sculpture, and architecture. And the course went from the ancient world to the modern era. And after each lecture, the professors would take photographic reproductions of the works of art that we just studied in class, and they would tack them up onto the walls of the art department study room. And each of these images had captions underneath with basic information about the work of art, and they were arranged chronologically around the room. And as the year wore on, hundreds of images would jostle for space on the study room wall, in some places reaching up to 7 feet high. And the intention was to serve as a study aid so that students could go and memorize the works. And in the weeks leading up to the final exam, dozens of students would cluster there, as you can see in this photograph, to revise and prepare for the test. And because the images were arranged chronologically, we would walk around the room in this kind of circular, kind of never-ending perambulation, trying to commit these works of art to memory. And in this way, the study room became like a magical time machine. I was able to walk through centuries of art history in just an hour or two. And it didn't really occur to me then that, as my female classmates and I were looking at ancient Greek sculpture or Italian Renaissance paintings or Cubist masterworks, that the story that we were walking through was essentially a story about art created by men. Now, of course, many years on, the canon has evolved to include artists and themes that were ignored when I was a student. And I think that the Art 100 course has been replaced by other approaches. But as my career as a museum curator has unfolded, it turns out that having studied history of art at an all-women's college was a practical beginning because it prepared me for a career of working with women. Now, as a student at the Courtauld a few years later, I had the distinct impression that my days at an all-women's college had been extended into graduate school. And it actually, that impression turns out to be pretty accurate because of the roughly 7,500 living Courtauld alumni, about 70% of them are women, 30% men. That gender split neatly mirrors that of art museum curators. In the United States, about 70% of art museum curators are women, 30% men. And here in London, at the Victoria and Albert Museum where I work, it's 75% curatorial staffing is female. Now, you might be wondering, actually, what is a museum curator? Well, curators are basically in-house scholars and storytellers for museums. Through their exhibitions and gallery displays and their lectures and books, curators tell stories about human creativity, ingenuity, and history. Now, I recall over the last sort of several decades of working in an art museum, I've noticed that also, happily, because many institutions value curatorial scholarship and expertise, curators also serve as the kind of pipeline to leadership. So I suppose you might be thinking that if 70% of curators are women in most art museums, and also curators are the kind of training ground for leadership, I bet you're assuming that there's a lot of women leading art museums in the world. But in fact, that is not the case. I also remember as a student watching the Royal of Art World feminist protests that burst into the headlines, led by groups like the Guerrilla Girls, who asked the provocative question in their 1989 poster, Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? The group campaigned, and actually still does, against the scarcity of women artists in museums. And their protest still applies, not just to artists, but also to arts world leadership. A woman has never run a top 3 art museum, and according to attendance figures, those are the Louvre in Paris, London's British Museum, and New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. Altogether, these 3 have been running for about 630 years, and not a single female director in sight. If you look at the top 20 museums in the world ranked by attendance, you can see that there are 3 female directors, but that's just 3 women leading the top 20 group of institutions where 70% of their curatorial staff are women, and that staff also is the training ground for leadership. Now, if you think about some of the aspects of, why there should be more women leading the museums, I would argue the following. First, art museums are high profile. Those top 3 institutions together receive a collective visitorship of around 20 million visitors a year. Many of those visitors are tourists who spend money at shops and restaurants along the way to visiting the Rosetta Stone and taking selfies with the Mona Lisa. In the United States alone, museums contribute $400 million to the American economy. So museums are, we've just learned, high profile, they're big business, therefore, and they're also significant employers. In Britain, museums, galleries, and libraries altogether employ 97,000 people. And in the United States, there are 400,000 jobs held in museums. So because museums are high profile, big business, and significant employers, their employment practices matter. And also, their directorships matter because museum directors not only crystallize the values that their institutions hold up as important, but they also influence, and in some cases, they decide what goes on the walls and in the galleries, which in turn influences what the public values and holds as important. So their employment practices matter. Now, imagining a cultural landscape where bias has no place, I think that gender should also be twinned with social and economic factors, issues of sexual identity and orientation, and also the broad range of able-bodiedness that makes up the real world and the real human experience, and that frankly differs from the profiles that we've come to expect in our cultural leadership. Now, I think that we're all aware of the many challenges that have made towards diversity in hiring of publicly traded companies, like corporate boards and executive corridors. If we're going to expand the horizons of the art world and aim for diversity of thought and leadership, we also have to diversify the leaders that head these institutions. If I look at the top 12 art museums in the world, this is what you'll see. And as you look at these figures, you'll notice that of the top 12, Britain is the only country to have more than 2 museums on that list. In fact, this shows that Britain has 4. And this is why it's my belief that when you're thinking about cultural leadership, Britain can and should lead the way. First of all, because Britain is a cultural superpower. These 4 institutions on the top 12 are proof of that. Also, Britain is no stranger to girl power. We have our 2nd female prime minister, and our current queen is the longest reigning monarch. But also, we have a better than average track record of appointing female museum heads. In addition to the top job at Tate Modern, and now, of course, the new head of the entire Tate organization, Britain also boasts 2 directors of non-arts-focused national museums. In addition, some museums outside of the national network, including our host, the Courtauld Institute of Art, also have female directors. Now, I would also argue that Britain can and should lead the way for all of these reasons, but also because Britain is trying through many efforts to address these issues through funding for curators from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, as well as internships for young people. And pro-women's efforts are also hard at work. So things are happening in Britain, but I think that more can be done. And meanwhile, across the water in the United States, population shifts indicate that in less than 20 years, the group that has historically served as the kind of core visitorship for museums, that is non-Hispanic whites, that group will become a minority of the US population. And for all of these museums, what this means, this is not just a sort of issue in the United States, but across the world, unless these museums start to radically rethink the way they do business and the way that they connect with their audiences, they're going to be serving an ever-shrinking segment of the population, and they will therefore become irrelevant. Now, I wish that I could go back in time, back to my freshman year self, first year at college, and tell myself to look again at the textbook that served as our reference for the Art 100 course. And if I'd done so, like I was able to do last week, because that textbook is still hanging around with all of its underlined pages and coffee stains, and if I'd counted the number of reproductions of works of art, I'd have seen that of the 1,031 works reproduced in its pages, only 12 were of works by women artists. Well, here I am, my freshman year self at Smith. I look really hard at work. I think I'm revising for an art exam. And you can see that on the wall to my left, there's a poster, and it features a post-impressionist artist, Aristide Malio's painting called La Femme à l'ombrelle. And I bought this poster on a trip to Paris, and I also bought that rather embarrassing black beret you see hanging from the heating pipe above it. And so this is my kind of college dorm room wall with the homage to that post-impressionist artist. And if you're wondering, still kind of unsure about the cultural influence that these big arts institutions wield, consider that last year, the top 20 museums, where only 3 women are directors, those top 20 museums received a collective total of 85 million people. That's 85 million people making what I think is today's modern day pilgrimage, traveling sometimes a great distance to visit a museum, standing in line to buy a ticket, going to look at a work of art, noticing how many people are there with them, probably noticing who the artist is, hopefully also reading what the museum curator has to say about it, and then walking down the corridor to find the gift shop, to buy the poster, which might end up on a college dorm room wall, thus furthering a particular view to be handed on to the next generation about whose art and what kinds of culture count. Thank you.